Okay, everyone. Thanks for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. I am so pleased to be here. I am Danny Nierenberg. I am president and co-founder with Bernard Pollock of Food Tank. We are a research and advocacy organization that's really devoted to telling stories of hope and success in food and agriculture systems around the globe. And we do this to really motivate, inspire, and activate businesses and policymakers, eaters, farmers, and others to make positive change toward our food systems. I am excited to be here to talk about this topic of ensuring that food businesses can be net zero. Many food businesses, as we all know, are making commitments, lots of commitments around the globe for 2030, for 2050, for tomorrow, for yesterday, etc. But I really think that we need urgent action and that it needs to happen now. There are many companies that are also doing a lot of greenwashing, and I'm sure you've seen that here at COP this week. And I think something that might even bother me a little bit more is this idea of green wishing. I believe that there are companies who are really mission driven and want to make things happen, but they're wishing them. They're not really trying to find the ways to actually make them happen. So I hope we can get into that and some other things. We'll talk for about 40 minutes. And then maybe open it up to the audience for Q&A, because I think it's really important for them to hear from you as consumers and people who are really concerned about these things. So I will hope you'll all help me welcome Lee Recht, the Vice President of Sustainability at Olive Farms. Round of applause. We have to keep the energy up. Thank you. Sally, I forgot your last name. Sally Smith, the Global Director of Sustainability and ESG at Upfield. I'm so sorry. Sarah, thank you. Round of applause. It's been a long day. This is my 18th panel. Sarah Fletcher is the Public Affairs Director for Oatly. Thank you for being here. And we have, of course, Pat Brown from Impossible Foods. So nice to see you, Pat. Thanks for being here. So Lee, I want to start with you. The last panel you were on, I gave you 2 minutes to talk, so you have a little bit more time this time. So Olive Farms, which I truly admire, and full disclosure, I am on the Sustainability Advisory Board of Olive Farms. I think it's important to say that, and I can tell you why in a few minutes. But I want to ask you, you've set this really ambitious goal of being net zero by 2025. And I wonder why this is so important to you as an individual, as a scientist. And I should have introduced you as Dr. Lee Recht, but as a scientist and as someone who is really concerned about the future of our food systems.
So thank you again for having me. Olive Farm is a cultivated meat company. So basically what we're doing is we're growing a cultivated beef steaks. Except we're utilizing the cells of the cow, but we're doing it this time outside of the cow's body, and we're doing it in a very controlled atmosphere. We consume energy, so we don't release methane like the conventional beef industry, but we do consume energy. I joined the company just about a month before COP25, and I came to Madrid, and what we saw was everybody was talking about these net zero targets for 2050, and we understood that there is the concept of building a company and then finding ourselves in 10, 20 years creating a very business as usual baseline that's very polluting, and only then creating such a very complex process of reduction just didn't make sense to me at all. So when we left, and I was here with my CEO and co-founder, and we left at Madrid, and we were inspired, and we understood that we want to do something different. We were a bit naive, I'm not going to lie, and we decided we were going to commit and build our company from inception as a net zero carbon company. And we did that not because we were trying to support the climate, which we completely are trying to do. We were really seeing it as a good business decision. We thought about it, we looked at it, we understood that this is where the future is taking us, this is where the future is. Cultivated meat by itself has the potential to reduce 92% of carbon footprint when compared to conventional beef production. But we also understood that today we're a young company. in 10 years, we're going to be a larger company. In 20 years, we're going to be a big corporate, hopefully. And we're going to need to be accountable for the way how we have built our production lines and how we have built our supply chains. And with that commitment, that kind of forces everybody, all stakeholders within our company, to align to that commitment. And that, for us, was a really critical aspect.
Those commitments internally are as important as they are externally. And I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit.
So you call green wishing. When I see green wishing, I actually, almost to a certain extent, think it's a positive thing. Because I am a green wisher. I do want really positive change. And sometimes it's very, very challenging because it really doesn't have the potential framework that you would expect it to have. So for example, we're building our company from inception. So that means we're not going to have a polluting baseline. And that means that we're not eligible to join the Race to Zero or the SBTI framework, which are both very, very good frameworks. And we believe in them, and we know that they have a tremendous amount of impact on big corporates. But now we want to take it the next step, and we want to have these big frameworks also support and push forward future companies, future industries, alternative proteins. We're all pretty much in the alternative protein sector. This is an emerging industry. We want to support them, build the industry in a better way, thinking about these elements of environmental impact, even social and financial and nutritional. These are all important, but if we're looking at the carbon, because we're here for climate, then we need to think about these things. And it is very difficult. People don't understand yet the concept of building a net zero carbon company from design or from inception. So there's a lot of engagement. There's a lot of leadership. There's a lot of, showing where we can help support and really bring in people to kind of join the cause with us. Because clearly right now we're going to be a case study, and there's not a lot of place for us to rely on right now. And I think that's something that we need to and that's something that for me, that's one of my agendas here at COP, is really try to push forward, thinking about how innovation should support the transition of the food systems. It's not here to, on my cause, it's not here to replace, it's here to support a transition, but also really thinking about how we can do it from design, from inception. This is a new stage of where we want to take climate.
Much. Sarah, so Oatly has decided not to make any net zero commitments, and I wonder if you can explain why. It should be on.
On? Yeah. Just trying to be different as always. No. No, I think so. First and foremost, we do think it's important that companies do set climate targets. We think that's incredibly important. But I think for us, we were just looking at the SBTI framework and saying, does this fit a rapidly growing food company that's not starting from an enormous baseline, right? Is this the right fit for us right now? Is it taking the food sector into account the right way? All of those pieces. And so there's a couple reasons, I would say, to start. Maybe to start first, Oatly is an oat milk company, but rather than that, we are a very sustainably minded company. We are on a mission to try to get as many people as possible, not dissimilar to folks on this panel, to be eating a more plant-based diet, to be switching over from cow's milk and cow's dairy over to a more plant-based diet on the whole. So I will get back to that later. But did just want to say, Oatly does have a company target. We have a climate target, and it is aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway as well. So we are looking at a 70% reduction by 2029 in greenhouse gas emissions per liter of Oatly. And so that's huge, right? We have quite a lot to do on that. Part of the reason I think that we also decided to go that route is we believe a lot in information. We talk a lot as a company, as everyone knows. We use a lot of words, sometimes to a fault. But part of what we think consumers and the larger market needs is broader transparency in this space, right? So with the idea of net zero or climate neutral, there's a lot of opaqueness. You don't really see what's happening behind the curtain. And so we believe in absolute numbers. We believe in absolute figures. Show what's going on with your company's footprint. Show what's going on with your actual reductions and removals, which should be the first and foremost focus of your company, is saying we do have a footprint, we do operate here, but we should be looking at reductions and removals of those of those emissions first and foremost before turning to something else. And we should be honest about what that all looks like. And so that's kind of where we landed there. And we also believe in transparency for consumers themselves, right? We put a carbon footprint on our packaging in Europe, and ultimately we will do that around the world. But we do that so that consumers can have that information and to make informed decisions from the get-go with that information. And so we think that's a bit more valuable sometimes than saying net zero, saying climate neutral, is giving that information to folks.
I think the honesty angle is such an important one. I want to come back to that. I want to come back to transparency and traceability, but I want to get to Pat, because Pat, when we spoke, I guess a few weeks ago now, you said I was asking the wrong question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And the question is, what do you think about these other alternative protein companies and beverage companies' strategies for achieving net zero?
Oh, okay. Well, that wasn't the question you asked when I said it was the wrong question, but I can answer
It was.
anyway. Well, I think let me answer it this way. I think net zero for a company that is making products to replace products that we use animals to make today is the wrong target, okay? Net zero is a failure. Because the real opportunity, sorry, you okay?
Microphone right here. Put it closer to your face.
Okay, sorry. The real opportunity is to unlock massive negative emissions, okay, to fix the historic problem. It's not just we're not going to contribute to the problem. It's a huge opportunity to turn back the clock on climate change. And I'll just quickly explain that from a climate perspective. So, animal agriculture is by far the most destructive technology on Earth. And it is overwhelmingly responsible for the global collapse of biodiversity, which, if anything, is a bigger threat to humanity than climate change. But let's set that aside. Sticking with climate, the thing about the emissions from animal agriculture, historic emissions from animal agriculture, is that unlike fossil fuel emissions, they are almost completely reversible, okay? You can't turn carbon dioxide back into coal. Thermodynamics says no. But you can turn carbon dioxide back into trees and plant biomass. Historically, the land clearing for animal agriculture released an amount of CO2 into the atmosphere over the past 200 years that is equivalent to about the last 20 years of fossil fuel emissions, or another way to look at it, it's about half of all the CO2 emitted from fossil fuel combustion in history. That's how much carbon dioxide was released clearing land for animal agriculture. But unlike the fossil fuel emissions, you can reverse it because you can turn CO2 back into plants. You can photosynthesis, the most mature carbon capture technology, optimized over billions of years evolution, will do it. And in fact, there's lots of case studies and pretty good evidence that all you have to do is stop animal agriculture and let the ecosystem recover. And I can give you examples of that. So what we're doing is we're making products that are intended to compete directly against meat that we use animals to make today. And we have designed those products so that they deliver everything that meat consumers want. In blind taste tests with hardcore meat consumers, the products we make are rated as good or better than the animal products by a majority of the people who test them, who cook them and taste them and so forth. They're nutritionally lower calorie, lower saturated fat, lower total fat, no cholesterol, equivalent protein amount and quality, equivalent bioavailable iron, and so forth. So they meet the nutritional needs. They're healthier, they're delicious, and vastly lower carbon and biodiversity footprint. In fact, last year our sales, or actually in 2021, I guess that was last year.
Last year.
I can't even keep track anymore. 2021, our sales, based on a very conservative estimate of what fraction of our sales displaced an animal product, i.e. the consumer bought our product and therefore didn't buy the animal product, spared as much CO2 emissions as would be produced by 200,000 American cars over the course of a year. It's equivalent to taking 200,000 cars off the road for a year. So we're generating massive negative emissions. If we went to zero emissions, that would be going backwards. It's net negative emissions. That's the huge opportunity from replacing animal agriculture.
I want to get back to this idea of replacing animal agriculture, which I find very controversial in lots of different ways. But I want to turn to Sally and wonder what your thoughts from, you talked about this being your first COP and listening to all of these different conversations, whether it's around meat. But what are your thoughts on how businesses can be net zero in this alternative protein space?
Yeah, I'm from a company called Upfield, and we make dairy alternatives, right? So butter, cream, cheese, 3 big categories. And I guess on the stage we've got the solution to most of the problem, right? With meat and milk in the mix, which I think in itself is really quite inspiring. So, firstly, a thanks for the invite, because I think it's a really important conversation to have. And when I reflect on the nature of the different companies we have up here, ours is different again, right? We're not a startup that has the opportunity to build something from scratch. We're not a smaller established player in predominantly a single category. And we're not in the cultured meat space innovating something new, right? We have an incumbent business model. 3 million tons of carbon a year we already produce. We operate in 95 countries. We have scale and distribution for plant-based already at our fingertips. We have a unique role that we can play in bringing to market some of these products at scale globally at pace, because we already do it. We've actually done it for 150 years, even though we've only been around for 4. So the products that we provide, they have to be delicious. They have to be affordable for people, and we've got products that are affordable, right? And people have to want to shift to them. They have to deliver on the nutritional piece, on the sustainability piece. And when you look at the question that, as it's been framed, you could answer it in that slightly reductionist way of what is solely my business doing on my own net zero targets. And we've got targets, right? We're absolutely committed to reducing our impact. Scope 1 and 2, we're going to be 0 by 2030. We've got a 25% total supply chain emissions, and that's for a very big company. But when you look at the scale of the opportunity that we have, that 3 million tons of carbon and the products that we sell today, if they were dairy products, right, there'd be additional 6 million tons of carbon in the system. That's what would be there if our products didn't already exist at scale in distribution, is an additional 6 million tons. So the challenge becomes, how can we accelerate what we do at pace? So if you're looking at a total food system and what needs to change from a carbon perspective, we absolutely have to create this space that enables that plant-based ecosystem to flourish in all the different ways that it needs to, and all the changes that need to be in place to do that. So yes, we've probably come at it with a slightly different framing as well. And, let's not beat each other up about the slight differences in the terminology. This is the same battle that we're all running, right? Meat and dairy's clearly the issue that we need to tackle in the food system when we choose what we eat. Yes, we've got to make sure that we provide products that are responsibly made and meet all the wider social criteria, environmental criteria, and economic cost criteria. But let's be clear, this is the solution to the problem of the cow, right? It's here and it's already here, and if we can scale that, I think we've got a great opportunity. So some of the things that we're actually doing, what are we doing to kind of drive that forwards? We've got a really accelerated plan ourselves around our own Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So we've got a legacy factory footprint, right? Old factories that have been around for many years. So we're not building new ones that you have the opportunity to put everything in from scratch as best, we've got to work out a really detailed CapEx plan. Well, we've worked out a really detailed CapEx plan, right? To completely transform the way in which we make the products we make today with the infrastructure that we have. So when we open a new factory like we've done in Canada recently, as we extricated from the business that used to own our brands, we took on a brownfield site in order to be able to do that. So there's huge opportunities, right?
And I love this idea about infrastructure and transportation that I want to come back to in a minute. Lee, I want to come back to you because you and I have talked a lot about the need for inclusivity when we're talking about these issues and not alienating certain audiences, certain players who are already part of the food system. And from my perspective, and again, this is my personal, I'm here as your moderator, I have no bets in this game, but from my personal perspective, I don't want to see livestock and dairy production completely go away. What I want to see is better livestock and dairy production. At the same time, while I want to see alternative products both flourish and do things in a different way than traditional agriculture has in the past. So I'm wondering how you, as again a scientist, somebody who thinks about these issues every day as part of your work, can reconcile those two, or if you can.
It's a really good question because I was just looking at the panel and I was thinking, you know what's missing here? I mean, we're a protein panel. And we're missing maybe a farmer that does regenerative agriculture, does rotation, does a sustainable livestock that can actually provide protein, whether a dairy or meat, but does it with a very low carbon and maybe even potentially a negative carbon if you do it really well. I'd love to have you join us, but honestly, because I think we're missing it, because the way I approach it is because we really are, so our inclusive approach is the fact that we are interested in transitioning the food systems, interested in transitioning the meat sector to becoming more sustainable, to becoming more resilient, thinking about food security, thinking about local production, and really understanding and putting the focus on that. So we all have mutual goals, right? It's not one instead of the other. It's all of us looking and saying, hey, how do we achieve a production of a resilient and sustainable way of producing our food? In this case, let's say our protein. It can be sustainable agriculture, whether it's plant agriculture or animal agriculture, and it can be through alternative proteins, but also in a sustainable way. Because clearly, and I will say this, clearly today the conventional meat sector is doing well when it comes to carbon emissions. So taking all of us and saying, okay, we're the plant-based or cultivated meat companies, we have already an advantage. But with that said, I do think that the net zero is critical because what we're trying to do is saying, okay, yes, our product is good, but we also need to start thinking, we don't want to be that big corporate that in 10, 20, 50 years is thinking, just like Sally, and saying, oh, now I need to think about how much resources I'm transitioning to that transition to becoming even more sustainable, even though I'm a plant-based product anyways. So my approach is looking at a mutual goal, saying this is the mutual goal. There's a diverse ways of achieving this mutual goal. It can be through innovation, it can be through sustainable agriculture. We all need to work together. We need to supplement. We need to think about it collectively. One is not necessarily best for the other, definitely depending on your region. Okay, so clearly there are regions that you can't even have animal agriculture, so maybe it's better to have local production, and that's why you see UAE and Singapore being very, very active in this because they have food security national plans. They really want to incorporate it. But in other areas like America, like the United States, like Brazil, you need to think about a much more inclusive solution because there you have a very strong livestock agriculture. I would also say that for me, alternative protein is there to support reducing the pressure that livestock agriculture has on only thinking about productivity and not really focusing on quality and safety and resiliency. And I think that's how we can support each other.
That collaboration is key. One thing, Sarah and Pat, that I want to ask you is, is this a binary? Is it either or? Is it either we only go plant-based or can we be inclusive?
That's not how I think about it. Not at all. I'll come out. I'm not a vegan, and I think that that's the name of the game, right? Is trying to get as many people to make these choices every single day, right? We have the ability, those of us who are fortunate enough to have that, to make a food choice multiple times a day, right? And so these are things that we can think about all the time. I don't need every single person to go vegan for this to happen per se, but it is an incredibly fast way. These are solutions we have in hand to be dealing with emissions that we can deal with right now. And so I think that our biggest goal, like we have a target of between 2019 and 2025, 2.9 billion liters of cow's milk drinkers, the liters themselves, switched over to oat milk. That has a potential for a 2.5 million ton CO2e reduction, right? That's a ton, a lot of tons of CO2e. And so that's a huge amount of change that you can make. That can be spread across the entire world. That's why we're trying to get access to our products all over the place, right? We want our products to be in Starbucks and to be in every grocery store across the US, all over China, all over Europe. That's where we are right now, and eventually everywhere else, so that people have the ability to make a choice, right? And they can look at their holistic diet and say, what are the right choices here?
Pat, what are the right choices from your perspective?
Well, I'd rather not look at it from the perspective of what consumers should be choosing, because it's a waste of time. The fact is that consumers will eat what they want, and no amount of education or nagging or anything from us is going to get people to stop eating meat and dairy products. That's been tried and it never works. The solution is to realize that the problem isn't that people love these foods, it's that we're using the wrong technology to produce them. Okay? We're using the world's most destructive technology, arguably the most destructive technology humans ever invented, animal agriculture, to produce these foods. And so the way Impossible Foods approach it, and just to be very blunt, my goal here was not I wanted to create some new kind of foods. I want to make the use of animals as a food technology go away as completely as possible, okay? And that's a great thing for the world as far as I'm concerned. And the way to do it is not to tell people what to eat, not to try to educate them about what's wrong with what they eat. It's to make something that they like better than what they're eating today. And that, I would say, at this point, we have very strong proof of concept that it's possible to make meats entirely from plant ingredients that meat consumers consider as, a majority of meat consumers consider as good or better than the animal products, and that are healthier and at scale are going to be way more affordable. And that's how you achieve the goal. It's not by complaining to consumers, whining at them, nagging them, and so forth. No, give them what they want and do a better job than the incumbent industry. And the impact on climate, by the way, if we could phase out animal agriculture over the next 15 years, which is our target, is it will create, within a decade or so, a 30-year pause in net greenhouse gas emissions, because it will unlock negative emissions from biomass recovery on the 45% of Earth's land-free surface that's used for livestock right now, and from methane and nitrous oxide decay. Those, unlike stopping fossil fuels, you just stop making things worse. Stop animal agriculture, you immediately start making things better. You're releasing negative emissions.
Am I on? Thanks. So the phrase "stop animal agriculture," I think for a lot of us is again controversial, as I said at the beginning. And so my question for you, Pat, is does this mean all animal agriculture? Or are we talking about the industrial side of this?
All. And in fact, from a climate standpoint, and this is very, very, tons of research on this. I hate factory farms. I hate industrial animal agriculture, at least as much as you do. But extensive animal agriculture is just as, if not more destructive from a climate standpoint. It's certainly more destructive from a biodiversity standpoint. All that land that's being used for, those organic cows or whatever is land that used to support biodiversity, very diverse landscape, all kinds of wildlife and plants and so forth. Now it's basically just grass and cows. So extensive animal agriculture, it's kind of a myth. It's a myth that the animal ag industry likes to promulgate because people, consumers like to think, wow, the cows are just happily munching on grass in this beautiful landscape and butterflies and everything's good. And it's a complete myth. And by the way, someone used the word sustainable animal agriculture. It's an oxymoron, okay? There is no universe in which that's sustainable.
Pat, we often disagree, and this is one of those times, but I wonder what the other panelists think, because I do believe that there are farmers and ranchers and hog farmers and others who are working really hard to do regenerative agriculture practices and make them, sustainable and make them tasty and delicious and help provide farmers an income. And so one of the things that I want to ask you, Sally, and you, Lee, and you, Sarah, is how can we incorporate this idea of a just transition so that we don't have the either or that Pat is describing, that we have all of these sort of solutions at once. So Sally, I don't know if you want to take that on.
Yeah, so we recognize the challenging space that this is because we end up talking about farmers' livelihoods. And the first point I would make is that farmers grow plants as well. And they can grow a whole heap of other things as stewards of the land if the system's correct. And you asked me a little bit earlier about my reflections on being at my first COP, right? And my biggest reflection is how amazed I am at the number of conversations about regenerative agriculture, about how we produce, right? How we grow food in the system, and how few conversations in comparison there are about what we eat and how we enable that transition, right? And so I'm not going to unpick the work that's being done because I am critically clear in my own head the scale of the challenge that we face here. And so, yes, fine, get on with all the work that's already happening. It's fantastic. And we need to differentiate between particularly kind of industrial versus non-industrial practices in what can be in place. But I'm not trying to answer that, right? I'm trying to answer how do we speed up the consumption question? How do you create the conditions for people to want to eat these delicious, affordable products? Because right now that, in the same way that right now the conversation is heavily around the what and not, the how we produce and not what we choose to eat, how do we enable more conversations on the what we choose to eat? Because it seems to be a bit taboo. And
sure.
I think from my perspective, we absolutely need to find a space to have that conversation as well, whether it's about perverse subsidies, perverse taxes, perverse laws on labelling, the ridiculous constraints that there are around innovation in the plant-based food sector, the solutions that need to come to the fore at pace faster to transition this, right? If we don't consider that what we eat, what we choose to eat every day, and how we enable the very rich, high-income, high-consuming, over-consuming populations to deal with that and confront it, and we don't back into and find ways to inspire the growing middle class who aspire to meat, to want to choose these products first, because we haven't collectively shot ourselves in the foot by vilifying, for whatever reason, the space. I think we're in real trouble. And my biggest concern, and therefore the biggest opportunity, I think, is to have more conversation about what we eat.
Absolutely. We can't blame farmers. We can't blame ranchers. That's not going to get us anywhere. So, Lee, you and I have talked a lot about this. As I said before, I'm on the Sustainability Advisory Board of Aleph Farms because you and its founder are omnivores, and that you believe in that farmers and ranchers and others need to be included in this conversation. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
So I'm listening to Pat and I'm saying, okay, when we look at extensive, by the way, I agree with you. Actually, factory farming and very, very industrial livestock could potentially, on a carbon alone approach, was probably more sustainable than extensive livestock agriculture. And organic to me is a certain amount of sustainable, but sustainable is a very complicated terminology. So when you look at a sustainable agriculture, organic doesn't necessarily gonna define what sustainable means. You need to think about sustainable on a financial level. You need to think about sustainable on an environmental level. You need to think about sustainable on a social level. And then, of course, you need to think about sustainable on an animal welfare level if you are in the concept of growing animals. And to that extent, I don't think there is enough sustainable agriculture. I agree with you that there are some people that are defining that they are sustainable and they are not sustainable. And we need to think about that. When you look at, there are very clear practices where you have combined livestock agriculture that is sustainable, that is actually almost, I would say to a certain level, critical for your climate regeneration. So for supporting the recycling of different nutrients, of carbon, of water, and so on. So to that extent, I think I agree with that we need to be very clear in how we define things, because currently today everybody's using the word sustainable and not everybody actually means the word sustainable.
Absolutely.
So I just wanted to make that clear on my side. We've decided to incorporate, I joined a company 3 years ago. We're a startup. I joined the company when we were about 18 employees. I'm the VP of sustainability there. It was a privilege to me to join a company that very early on really saw how we want to create a sustainability strategy, whether it's in the carbon aspects and whether it's in the social aspects. One of the things that we thought about was about the social justice aspect about it and what we can do to actually work and give value to the different farmers and livestock farmers, whether it's in a direct way or even in an indirect way.
Sure.
So sometimes, potentially, first of all, we looked at it and we kind of took a step back and really wanted to approach it in more of a holistic way of how the meat sector needs to transition and where cultivated meat can support that transition in more of an indirect way. Another thing that we're doing is we're currently working on, we're actually collaborated with the Federation University in Australia. We're working with a specific Professor Sandhu, that's focused on, he's an ecologist and an economist in the food systems. And what we're doing is we're doing a social economic research that is assessing how cultivated meat can enter the meat sector and give value to all stakeholders within the meat sector, and with an emphasis on the farmers and livestock farmers. And we're looking at different regions that represent different ways of cattle ranching, I would say, because there is the US, that you have that really clear industrial agriculture. You have different areas in Europe where you have the more extensive livestock agriculture, and then you have the global south where you have a lot of smallholder farmers. And each one of those, we need to create innovative business models.
Sure.
I will say this, I'm looking at you just because I found out you're a livestock rancher. We want to partner with the ranchers, with the livestock, to be part of this research. And currently, they're not interested. And that makes it extremely difficult for us. So I invite, and this is part of what I do, is I kind of speak a lot about this research, and I'm continuously inviting people, either if it's universities or associations. They all love our cause. We have great personal relationships, but they're very, very nervous about being part of such a research like that. And
Sure.
what I'm saying here is that for us to really create that just transition, obviously it can't be only one-sided. It needs to have all sides of the stakeholders in there. And to that extent, I think that's where policy and government need to really step up. They need to support a framework for us where we can be there together, where it's not us inviting, it's not a cultivated meat or alternative protein company inviting a rancher to join our conversation, especially when they hear other colleagues of mine saying that they want to completely stop this industry completely. That's not where my approach is. And therefore, I think that sometimes we need that neutral approach
Sure.
that can help us.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. I want to get off picking on Pat for a while and turn to the issue of transparency. So, Pat and Sarah, I want to talk a little bit about how both of your companies address this issue of transparency to eaters, whether it's through transportation, your ingredients, you know, what you're, for Oatly, you have an amazing label that shows a lot of different information. So I'm wondering how you address that transparency that will really speak to consumers and make them want to buy your product and also understand the impact that it has.
Sure. Again, it's about giving the information, right? And giving it in absolute and real words. And so for us, we've been doing the sustainability report for at least 5 years now. That goes through every piece of our business, right? It goes from top to bottom, all the scopes. And so for us, for example, in terms of trying to get to that 70% reduction, the first thing that's the biggest thing for us is our ingredient sourcing, right? So that's oats, that's canola oil, and that's a huge portion of our greenhouse gas emissions and all of the other elements of impact as well. And so for us, that's taking a look at regenerative agriculture and saying, how are we working with farmers to figure out how to, for example, in the United States, we source almost all of our oats in North America and Canada. So first it's partnering with the farmers that we source from in Canada and saying, how are we looking at this relatively scaled oat growing and saying, what can we improve on and how can we tie real outcomes to that, right? So it's not just the words regenerative agriculture, it's not just practices, it's what are the outcomes that we're looking to achieve? What do you need from us to help get there? What do you need from our grain buyer to help get there? What do you need from the government to help get to those outcomes? But we need outcomes so we can track that so that we can then report on that, right? And be honest and transparent with our customers. So that's the first thing around regenerative agriculture is you need all of those pieces together. And then on the operations side, part of those reductions are going to be things like at our factories moving to 100% renewable energy. I represent North America, so I'll speak to North America, but also globally. Electricity is not a problem, right? We can get to 100% green electricity a various number of ways, depending on the region. Green thermal, that's a major problem. And so that's where we also need policymakers to help us to figure out what's the infrastructure to help make that happen. The other places that we're looking at are zero solid waste to landfill. You know, we have a fiber residue that comes from our process. We're actually able to use that in the US at our 2 factories with partners to take that and turn that into biogas, put that back into the grid, and eventually hopefully get some of that power back to ourselves and also contribute to the community. And then having water withdrawals, right? So all of these measures are incredibly important, and it's important that they're reported on frequently and at a regular clip, which is why things like the SEC proposed rule on climate disclosures for public companies is really exciting for us if it includes all of these measures, including Scope 3. So companies should have to report, consumers should be asking for it. We try to make it a little easier than reading our very long report for consumers by putting a footprint on pack so that they can take a look at it. That footprint right now means nothing because they have nothing to compare it to. And so we need other companies to also put that level of transparency out on the pack. We do think that just as with calories, fiber, protein, all the things that you see in nutrition for a food product, you should be seeing the same thing related to environmental impact and having that be something that does go into making your decisions. I do think consumer change can actually be a major impact. The IPCC has said so as well, right? The mitigation report from earlier this year cited lifestyle change, and that does happen at the ground level with individual choice. So there can be systemic change. It is driven by that immediate change on the ground. That happens when consumers have the right information. Sometimes it's not as big a driver as taste. I'll give you that. That one comes first. So if you taste good and you're cool, sometimes that helps quite a lot. But if they get that information, it helps quite a bit too.
Thank you. Pat, and I just need to say why I love you is because of your bluntness and your honesty. So go.
Okay. Well, yeah, I really appreciate that because I just feel like we got to have an honest conversation. One thing I want to address before I get to life cycle analysis and so forth is that there was the assumption that we're against farmers and ranchers. And nothing could be further than the truth. And in fact, we are very actively working with farmers and ranchers on, I think, a wonderful plan for a transition for them that leaves them way better off than they are now. And I'll just do the real quick explanation there. So first of all, a piece of information. In the U.S., according to the USDA Census of Agriculture, the average income of every rancher and farmer in the beef industry in the last census across the whole country was a negative number, okay? It's a terrible business to be in from a financial standpoint. More than 70% of them are losing money every year.
Sure.
And the average is a negative number. So there's a huge opportunity here because we've done a calculation of the carbon capture potential across the U.S. and around the world of the land that's currently being used for animal agriculture. Most of it is for cattle. And the amount of money those farmers could make as literally in year one and for the next probably 50 years afterwards by just letting the biomass recover on their land, okay, the original biomass recover on their land, is way more than they're making with their current activity. So that's a huge opportunity. In fact, you know, even at the low prices in the current voluntary carbon market, almost every cattle farmer in the U.S. could immediately be making more money by just losing the cows. And in the rest of the world, it's even more extreme because the carbon capture potential in the U.S. of livestock land is lower than most of the rest of the world, and yet still it's a huge opportunity. Okay. Anyway, I can back that up. And so I love farmers and ranchers. I just want them to do something that's more lucrative. Then the life cycle analysis. So we publish a life cycle analysis regularly, and even when we introduce a new product, we do an LCA of that. And we also do an LCA of the product that it replaces. And it's on our website. We publish the document and so forth. Anyone can look it up. We can't fit it on the package, okay? So, and as you were saying, if we did, no one would understand anyway. But we have on our website also an impact calculator where a consumer can look up for any product of ours that they buy, what's the net impact on their carbon, on their water footprint. What's the other thing, Arjun? Oh, land use footprint. And the basic point is we have greenhouse gas emissions, but when you buy our products, the impact on your footprint is a huge net negative because if you replace beef from a cow with our product, you've reduced your footprint massively. Same for water, same for land. So that's why I keep saying that, you know, this business we're in is basically net negative from a destructive impact on the environment. And that's why like zero would be a step backwards.
Got it. Thank you so much. Sally, if you could just make your remarks quick, I want to get to the audience.
Yeah, so a couple of points on transparency in particular. So carbon labeling, yeah, we do it as well. We've built a tool that allows us to take what was a 6-month process to get a full peer-reviewed LCA to a 30-minute process that allows us to calculate on every pack of every cream and every butter for the whole of the European Union, UK, US and Canada, so that we can do that automatically to get more information to more people more quickly, because the process just takes way too long and costs way too much. So we've invested money behind that consumer information drive because we think that's really, really crucial and really critical. Get the point that the absolute number is meaningless, so the data that we're getting also compares, right? It compares to the dairy impact to allow the consumer to understand those two things side by side. The dairy industry might not share that information as widely currently in the same way. I would encourage them to do so. I think it encourages everybody to improve. So if there's practices out there that are great, and there are some farms that do share their practice, and I commend them for doing that, I'd love to see the same stats widely adopted across the industry. We do report, share scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, our plans and what we're doing to improve. The bit that we've done that I think is a little bit different though is in January this year we also published our methane footprint, right? So the one thing that's unusual about us is we actually still have some dairy in our portfolio because we have this 150-year legacy, right? So 1% of our ingredients, 1% is dairy currently. and that accounts for 8% of our total greenhouse gases. We have a commitment to eliminate all of that by 2025. That's part of our route map to net zero, is get rid of the dairy for our company, right? It's a huge win that we can get to pretty quickly because loads of our portfolio doesn't have dairy in it and it tastes great. And that methodology we thought was going to be really hard, but it actually turned out to be really easy because the data's there. And we know how important methane is, right? Methane, that 8% of carbon equivalents, the methane proportion of it, that's 60% of our methane footprint. When the UNEP says we need to be at 45%, the methane pledge is at 30%, there's a gap that the food industry can really easily bridge with this transformation. So that transparency and being really clear about the data and what it drives you to in terms of action, actionable things you can do now, really, really important.
Absolutely. Transparency, honesty, as Sarah said before. These are all important things. What I've appreciated about this panel before I turn to questions is they've talked about opportunities for eaters, opportunities for them as businesses, and opportunities for farmers and ranchers and other stakeholders. So thank you all so much. Give them a round of applause, and then we'll turn to questions. So, sir.
Thanks. Alistair McLeod, I'm a cattle rancher in Australia. First thing to say is I'm full of admiration for the innovation that you guys are showing in your businesses. Really interesting things you're talking about. I'm actually really pleased to hear that most of you understand the nuance that not all animal agriculture is bad, and there are actually some ways of doing animal agriculture really well. Pat obviously will be disappointed to hear that I'm making very good money out of our cattle ranching at the moment. So I'm going to be in business for a while yet, I think, Pat. But actually there were some things I really agreed with you on as well. Obviously we should stop land clearing to make way for more cattle ranching. That's just completely wrong. The thing that I was delighted to hear you say is that there's a difference between fossil fuel emissions and livestock emissions, because fossil fuel emissions have been in the ground for millions of years, whereas livestock emissions have just come from photosynthesis. So we agree on quite a lot. I guess what I'd like to ask you all, though, is what's wrong with an animal system whereby there are animals grazing on diverse pastures, the landscape has got lots of trees and shrubs and bushes on it, we're planting lots of trees on our land, we're sequestering lots of carbon in our soils, we can demonstrate that we're carbon neutral, carbon positive even, so we like to think that we're making a contribution to the solution just as much as some of you guys are doing, but yet so often all animal agriculture is dismissed as being of no value.
Thank you for pointing that out. I've seen this at this conference more than once, farmers being blamed, and I want to reverse that. So I'd be interested in hearing from all of you. We have about 3 minutes to answer this question, so I don't know who wants to take it on first.
Yeah, I don't think we should be throwing out any solutions, right? Like, we have enormous problems to solve. People aren't tackling food fast enough. This is the first time we've had food pavilions here. And so this is very exciting that we're talking about it at all. So we should not be throwing out solutions like that. I have seen fantastic farms with really, really smart rotational grazing with lots of diversity of crops. I think that's fantastic. I would love to share numbers. I would love to share outcomes and all of that, just to talk about it. But I think that that is possible. My question is on scale and speed, right? So the number of operations like that can happen to feed the ambition of the meat and dairy industry, I don't know that those things match, right? Where large-scale industrial dairy, for example, that comes from a very particular place at those volumes, and they're looking to increase consumption. I don't know if that can happen from those operations at the speed we need it to with this emergency that we're facing. So that would be my question, and I think we can talk about it a lot. But I do think, like, again, we should not be throwing out any solutions. We do often have really tough conversations with farmers who feel like they are being blamed by us for quite a lot. And there were some really great points being made here, right? Farmers can grow plants, and they do grow plants, right? So with the farmers that we're working with in the Midwest, for example, in the United States, their neighbors are raising hogs, their neighbors are raising cattle. They might be growing feed for those industries as well. We need to be shifting those farms as well and trying to think about what is a sustainable model for those folks as they transition toward a more sustainable food system with us. But there's also an immediacy issue, and that's where our products can come in on the consumer side. So that's my perspective.
Thanks, Sarah. Lee, you get the last word.
Okay, I would say just, in the U.S., in California specifically, there's something called a low carbon fuel standard. And I think we need to do that also when it comes to meat. We need to look at it as an industry level, understand what the standard is, and find different ways to resolve it and lower the carbon of the way we're producing it. Again, I don't want to be in a carbon tunnel vision kind of approach, but for this case specifically that we're here on climate and greenhouse gases, I think we can look at that and think about it as an industry standard and understand that there are many ways to achieve it. Cultivated meat being one of them, plant-based being another, very, very healthy, sustainable livestock in a very science-based methodology. Everything needs to be science-based, by the way. I don't think you can just say I'm sustainable and just leave it by that. It all needs to be proved with either LCAs or different kinds of methodologies of really being accountable for it. So I would say that is a way that we can look at it and approach it in a way that we have diverse solutions to achieve a mutual goal.
Absolutely. That diversity is key, whether we're talking about what kinds of foods we're producing or the people who are producing it. So I want to thank our panelists. Please give them a round of applause. I want to thank our audience. Please give yourselves a round of applause. And I want to thank the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations for making sure that we could have this event in this pavilion and for putting COP on the table. Let's bring it forward. Thank you all.